relevant, reliable, and researched. This is Experts on Call, the show focused on delivering leading-edge news and information on today's most beneficial products and services. This is Experts on Call on AM 650.
Welcome back to the program. Sterling Fox with you, joined in studio by Tony Gioventu, the Executive Director of the Condominium Homeowners Association of BC, also the Vancouver Province and 24 Hours condo columnist, and a real treat to have Adrienne Murray, Strata lawyer from White Rock, back with us on the show. Adrienne, Doris sent us this really interesting email, and thank you, Doris. And here we'll have another bash at it this time around because there are some unanswered questions. I'm going to read a portion of Doris's email because as a lawyer, you listen to this, and you look at it, and you go, wait a second, there's a lot of information we need before we can really comment on it. But she says, I bought a unit last fall that had 3 parking spaces included in it. They were listed as part of the sales agreement, identified as so-and-so down on P3. Council recently advised me they are reallocating parking spaces to people who don't have them, and I will be losing the one space I don't use. So, she asks, how can the council take away a space that I bought? And Adrienne, your first reaction was, how do we know Doris actually bought the parking spot? She may think she was or has, and her realtor may have very well convinced her that she has, but in law, that may not be the case.
That's right, and the seller may have thought the seller was selling their parking spaces, and that may not have been the case either. So the first thing that you have to do is you have to understand the designation of the parking, and the first place to look is on the strata plan. So if we look at the strata plan and we see that it was limited common property parking spaces where they're designated for a strata lot, well then, these spaces go with the strata lot.
Okay, and but that's pretty straightforward, right?
Very straightforward.
Okay.
But if we see that they're common property, the fundamental of common property is that it's owned by all owners within the development, and it's within the control of the strata council.
Right.
The next question we have to ask is, could there have been a developer's lease in place where the developer leased the parking, as I indicated it at the front end where we have the developer marketing the development? The developer might have leased the parking spaces to the initial buyer. The initial buyer may have paid for 3 parking spaces.
Right.
And those parking spaces then will have been assigned to the subsequent buyers as each subsequent buyer comes along. So
and Doris is, just for the record, Doris is the 3rd owner now of this particular property.
But she may have the benefit of these subleases if they were in place initially. So the question, how can the council take away the space? The answer might be perhaps they can't.
Yeah, right.
But we don't know that. We don't know until we start identifying whether there was a parking lease. Now, that's where the fun begins.
Now, Tony, based on your years of experience, is this one particular area where potential buyers simply go off the rails because of insufficient homework?
Well, I don't know if they go off the rails because of insufficient homework, but I think that the bigger problem is they make assumptions that the information presented to them is true.
Okay.
Right? And sometimes I think you just have to, you barely scratch the surface. You have to go behind the door and ask the bigger questions. And as Adrienne pointed out, you have to ask the bigger questions about the history of this. But when the developer creates the Strata Corporation and all the parking and everything else is created along the strata lots, at that point when they've created their disclosure statement and they start selling strata lots, they will create these leases, and the leases will create assignments that may very well have a long-term survival with the strata lots for the period of time. Oftentimes they're 99 years. That's not uncommon.
Okay.
So, but the difficulty for the Strata Corporation is that the developer at the first AGM actually is required to provide a list of the allocations.
Okay.
So allocations for parking, storage lockers, those things, that rarely happens. And so the strata corporations rarely have these allocations. And so here you have this collision between the strata council seeing that we have common property and that we're going to designate, and we have people who had these leases or allocations for 3 parking spaces or an additional storage space for their boat in the back parking lot or something like that, that these things were created that the strata corporation actually doesn't have records for. And so nobody really knows what the answer is. And it's very difficult to administer. This is going to change, though, because January 1st, 2014, the Form B information certificate is going to change, where strata corporations are now going to have to disclose particular information about the status of storage lockers and parking spaces.
Okay.
Right?
Oh, okay.
So this is, here's another little time window, but we basically have a little over a year and a half for strata corporations to get their parking information and storage locker information, their parking plans, these leases, the information, start getting it together so they can, competently respond to these questions and competently fill out these information certificates. The strata's not actually saying that, you have a lease that you're designated, strata lots 23, 24, 25
Right.
for your parking spaces, but they will be saying things like how the parking is designated. Is it common property? Is it actually designated as limited common property? Are there other agreements that may impact this? There is going to be required some conscious disclosure by the strata corporation about the condition of the parking in the asset. So the strata is no longer this third player outside that wonders how the parking is transferred. They're now an intimate player in this relationship, so they have to understand the inventory, how it's administered, how it's disclosed, and then of course that'll have a huge impact on future buyers as well.
Adrienne, I was telling you that I read Tony's column in the Vancouver Province every Sunday quite faithfully, and that it's in the home section.
Yes.
So that section is full of adverts for condos and strata properties and so on, and parking is a big deal. I mean, some of the advertisements will single out parking spots available, and they'll price them out, and they're not cheap. So, I mean, this is very important stuff, and yet it seems that again, it's something that people don't perhaps read the fine print sufficiently enough.
Well, I also think it goes back to the idea, and Doris said that the sales agreement indicated 3 parking spaces,
right,
which means the seller of her strata lot that she just purchased said, I have and I own these 3 parking spaces. Mm-hmm. Well, in strata, it's not uncommon. If I've been using the same parking spaces for 5 or 6 years and I was told they were mine, I may believe they were mine. One of the biggest challenges is convincing the sellers of strata to actually understand whether or not they own the property that they're trying to sell. So when I say these are my parking spaces, the next question is, well, maybe I just have a right to use them. They're not really mine. Now, the issue with Doris as well, we're going to go back to that next, the seller that she purchased from.
Right.
And we're going to say, well, how is it that you could include these on your listing? What gave you the right? Maybe the seller knows that there's a developer's lease.
Right.
And that will make life simple. On the other hand, maybe the seller is going to say, well, I don't know, I've been parking there for the last 5 years, and the seller before me said they were my parking spaces. Well, then we need to start doing a little more investigative work to try and find out what the background was for this belief that these parking spaces came with the strata lot.
But now you and Tony both, in the course of your duties, spend a fair bit of time educating realtors. And I would think somewhere in this mix are realtors, clearly the seller's agent and Doris's agent, who connected those 2 parties to make this deal go forward. Should one or both of those realtors have identified those details vis-a-vis these 3 parking spaces the seller claimed he or she had and included in the listing that Doris bought? Basically, hey, it says 3 parking spots. Sign me up. I'm good for that.
Without a doubt. Without a doubt, this is exactly the type of thing that we talk about in every class that I teach to realtors when we talk about parking. And part of the problem is that when the realtor's taking the listing, the seller may say, these are my 3 parking spaces. It's up to the realtor to then ask the questions to determine, are they in fact usable, something that we can include on the listing. So I think it starts with the listing realtor when they take the listing to ask the seller and investigate with the seller.
What is it you've got for sale?
Exactly.
Right.
Do you have something that we can actually pass on to the buyer? And then of course the buyer's realtor is not off the hook either. If the listing realtor in the listing says it comes with 3 parking, the buyer's realtor should say, what's my client's legal right to park there?
Right. Show me the evidence that says there are 3 parking spaces included in this package, and then we'll buy it from you.
That's exactly.
So again, somebody's dropped the ball here, Tony.
Well, there's another issue, and I saw this recently on a parking plan where there were leases. Leases don't always necessarily assign a specific spot either. They might just guarantee you get 3 spaces. And we saw this recently on a project in Port Moody where the parking itself was not numbered. The parking space, the parking's common property, what was assigned was the guarantee of 3 spaces.
Okay.
And that makes it even a little more dodgy. Makes it a little bit more difficult to try and establish what the allocations were. And maybe it isn't about an allocation, because what we have sometimes is sometimes people are assigned a parking space because maybe they have special needs. They need a wider space.
Got to be close to the elevator.
Could be a
all
handicapped space, something like that. And maybe there wasn't the ability to make those assignments, right? And so if you're buying in thinking that you were getting the extra wide space, maybe that isn't the allocation, and maybe that isn't what was intended, or maybe there was a change. That's the other thing. People buy in, they'll sign these leases, and they're allocated parking spaces 32, 33, 34.
Right.
After a week or two of being there, they go back to the developer and say, can you change these, because they don't really work for us. So they have 2 or 3 other parking spaces in conjunction with those, and what ends up happening is there's no record of what happened historically. So finding these documents around these original relationships with the developer is absolutely fundamental.
Now, we need to take a break, but Adrienne, just before we do, the Strata Council in Doris's case has said, we're going to take that space you never use. We need that because there are now new tenants and we need to give them parking spots. That's kind of arbitrary as well. And do they not have any evidence that they have the right to do that? Do they? Again, Doris doesn't say that, they came to us going, wait a second, it says right here we have the right to take that spot that you think you own back. So again, there's a lot of gray area going on here.
Well, and again, that wouldn't be uncommon that a strata council jumps to a conclusion or makes an assumption without the facts.
Okay.
And
okay.
and in this case, with as in pretty much all the common property issues, parking and storage, we need to get the facts.
Doris, we do appreciate your email. It's quite a conversation starter this time around, and if you would like to send us an email and get us going in your direction, we'll give you that address when we return here on Key Pacific's Talk About Strata.
There's still more ahead with Experts on Call, the show focused on delivering relevant and beneficial consumer information. This is Experts on Call on AM 650.